The legislative calendar shifts towards spring adjournment, but not before dealing with some heavy-hitting issues. One hot-button topic nationwide and right here in Iowa is gun control. To talk about it, we sit down with Republican Matt Windschitl and Democrat Ras Smith on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Now celebrating more than 40 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, March 30 edition of Iowa Press. Here is David Yepsen.
Any American with a television, computer, or mobile phone was hard-pressed to miss the protest images from Washington, D.C. this past weekend. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, many of them young people, marched in favor of gun control measures. The public outcry for federal legislation comes in the wake of yet another mass casualty shooting in Florida last month. But here in Iowa, a different proposal hangs in the balance at the State House. A series of votes are needed to add additional language to the state constitution regarding firearms and what defenders claim would preserve the Second Amendment. We've gathered a pair of Iowa House members to discuss these topics. Representative Matt Windschitl is a Republican from Missouri Valley, and Representative Ras Smith is a Democrat from Waterloo. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us today. Welcome to Iowa Press.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us here this morning.
Across the table, James Lynch is political writer for the Gazette, and Kathie Obradovich is political columnist for the Des Moines Register.
Representative Smith, let's start with you. This week, Justice John Paul Stevens, retired Supreme Court Justice, said in an op-ed in the New York Times, we should just repeal the Second Amendment. Do you agree?
I don't agree with that. I mean, I support the Second Amendment. I think our founding fathers knew what they were doing when they put that in the Constitution, but I do think that it's time that we do take a closer look and make sure it's relevant to today's society.
How so?
I think when the Second Amendment was written, we were talking about muskets. We now live in a different time. Technology has shown that our weapons have the ability to have mass casualties in the blink of an eye. And I think that's something that we have to reflect upon because that wasn't a real relative factor when the Second Amendment was written.
Representative Windschitl, I know you don't agree, but let me ask you this. Does the fact that we're having this conversation now reflect a level of frustration with the ability to enact gun safety laws? And also, do you think that the NRA has overstepped its hand or overplayed its hand when it comes to using the Second Amendment to stop all gun safety laws?
Well, I don't think it's about stopping the protection of the public, but I also think the level of frustration is on both sides because I think many of the people that are taking out to do some of these protests aren't really understanding what it is that they're asking their government to do. When Justice Stevens is advocating for the repeal of the federal Second Amendment, what he's advocating for is basically the repeal of a natural law. We all have an inalienable right to self-defense, and the Second Amendment is merely a protection of that natural right. So the level of frustration comes in where you've got a lot of people that are advocating for safer schools or safer communities, but you're not necessarily going to get those safer schools or safer communities by taking away the rights of law-abiding citizens.
The Second Amendment originally, according to Justice Stevens, was related to not individual gun rights, but actually militia, dealing with state militias and their ability to stand up to a federal, if they wanted to protect state rights against the federal government. So, you know, how do you reconcile that with the fact that we're now using the Second Amendment to be you know, you say a natural law for individual privacy rights?
To put it very simply, I believe Justice Stevens gets it wrong. The debate on whether the Second Amendment was a collective right versus an individual right has been going on for a very long time now. If you look at the majority opinion in the Heller v. D.C. case, where Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, wrote the majority opinion, they affirmatively said it is an individual fundamental right, not a collective right. So it wasn't necessarily about just having a militia that was well-regulated or well-trained. It was about allowing the citizens of this great country to be able to have the arms that would be necessary, not only to defend the country, but also to protect against a potential tyrannical government.
Respond to that, Representative Smith, because he's unpacked a lot here, but you know, you've got some competing rights in the Constitution. Right. You know, we have the right to protect yourself, but you've also got the right to life, the right to liberty. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think we have to really put things in perspective. The Second Amendment has its place in our society, and we do have individual rights. And I do believe, I mean, I'm an avid hunter, so me and my shotguns, we're close. But at the same time, I do think we have to reflect upon that and think of a system that works in today's world. I think if we look at things in a tiered way, maybe we come to an agreement where we can figure out, I think this is not a situation in which we can't have our cake and eat it too. I think we can really do that, but it will be irresponsible for us to not use this opportunity to have a really constructive conversation. And I think if we do that collectively, then we'll find that the Second Amendment has its place. We have our individual rights, but when does that trump our right to feel safe?
What is it that you like to hunt, by the way?
Pheasant, turkey, I'm gonna get into quail, and if I can get a good mallard, I'm going to be happy.
we want to switch the conversation to the proposal that you're discussing in the legislature, to add the constitutional language of the Second Amendment to the state constitution. And we've got a graphic of that. It's House Joint Resolution 2009. And it says, and I quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The sovereign state of Iowa affirms and recognizes this right to be a fundamental individual right. Any and all restrictions of this right shall be subject to strict scrutiny." James has a question about that.
Well, I think the first question people ask is, why do we need this language when the Second Amendment has existed in the federal Constitution for more than 200 years? Why do we need to add this to the state language, Representative Windschitl?
There's multiple reasons. Number one would be that Iowa is one of 6 states that is completely silent when it comes to protecting a person's individual fundamental rights to keep and bear arms. The other thing that I would highlight is everything that we see going on today. And it's what Kathie brought up about Justice Stevens advocating for the repeal of the federal Second Amendment. Iowans deserve protections in our state constitution because the Constitution is a contract with the people to say this is what your government cannot do in restricting your rights. And with us being completely silent in our Constitution about the right to keep and bear arms and the natural rights to self-defense, I believe that's a disservice to Iowans. So that's why I believe it is ultimately important that we give Iowans the final opportunity or the final say in having that in our state constitution.
Representative Smith, the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate have both passed or approved House Joint Resolution 2009, and it, as Representative Windschitl says, it goes to the public eventually. Did you support that resolution, and what do you think about adding that language to the state constitution?
I did not support that resolution. We did offer an amendment that would have adopted the federal Second Amendment to the Iowa Constitution, and we thought that was more applicable. I think this House Joint Resolution is extreme. I think it goes a little bit further than our federal Second Amendment language, and we know that was up for an amendment, and that amendment failed. I think when you look at things, if we're not looking at it holistically, I think we're doing a disservice. And to push it that far, we're opening ourselves up to be in a situation in which further gun reform that will be more common sense, it's going to make it extremely difficult to pass that. And I think we'll also be caught up in litigation in our court systems as well with challenges to this.
Representative Windschitl, the federal Constitution doesn't talk about strict scrutiny. What does that language mean to you, and what do you think the effect would be on existing gun laws and challenges in court to existing gun laws?
Well, we can look at some of the other states that have passed similar language recently. It's not identical to what we're proposing here in Iowa, but it does incorporate the strict scrutiny standard. And without getting into all the legalese of it, strict scrutiny is the highest level of judicial review. The way I simplified it in my floor remarks was it means that we mean it, that any and all restrictions of this individual fundamental right shall be subject to strict scrutiny. It means that the government bears the burden of narrowly tailoring a law that is not arbitrarily restricting a person's individual fundamental rights. And just to expound upon that, with the U.S. Supreme Court cases declaring that the right is an individual right and a fundamental right, that means that this shall be subject to strict scrutiny already. But we wanted to make sure that it was incorporated into our language so that a future legislature or a future judiciary could not try and nibble around the edges and circumvent what the people of Iowa truly deserve.
Could the federal ban on civilian ownership, for example, of machine guns, would that stand up to strict scrutiny under this amendment, do you think?
Yes, I believe it. I believe it has, and I believe it shall. Because that's already settled case law. We've had a ban on fully automatic weapons since the 30s and early 40s. Even in Justice Scalia's majority opinion, he said that it's not an unlimited right. So there are restrictions that are potentially necessary or applicable, and this language isn't going to take us into a path or down a road that is extreme where we're undoing the regulations we have on the books now.
So Representative Smith, hearing what he says about the strict scrutiny phrase, what specifically is it that you're worried about? What gun laws do you think might not stand up to strict scrutiny in the courts?
Well, I think, looking at opportunities to look at maybe red flag laws and things like that would make it extremely difficult under this current under the proposed language. I'm fearful of a situation in which an individual walks into a college campus, and now we're going to litigate that in court, and with our mental health crisis that we have, and trying to make sure we have thorough background checks and things like that to kind of curb some of the violence that we're seeing. This language, I think, makes that extremely difficult. And when we have 30 county courthouses that are going to be closing, it's going to be extremely difficult for people to get their fundamental constitutional right of a speedy trial in their day in court over a gun challenge if we don't have things available, and that's what really concerns me about the language. So
you're saying that the courts are going to fill up with gun challenges and people won't be able to litigate other issues?
Well, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences that, or maybe intended, I don't know, but I do think we're going to find ourselves in a situation where, yes, we're going to have a lot of challenges in the court system over how far this really goes.
And I can see that you disagree with that, Representative Windschitl.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, tell us what part you don't agree with.
There's a couple of things, and I respect where Representative Smith is coming from, but this doesn't prohibit a future legislature from going in and enacting some type of reform, whatever that may be. It just means that they have to narrowly tailor it to effectuate a compelling government interest, and the compelling government interest may be public safety. So as things develop, as culture and society changes, there may be some things that we want to look at in the future as far as trying to corral down some changes that have happened. As far as the court system goes, people say that this is somehow going to undo the current regulations we have on the books and that it's going to lead to all these court challenges. Pardon me. But in the other states that have adopted a strict scrutiny standard in recent years, while they have had court challenges, I do not see any evidence that it's clogged up their court system. And quite frankly, their laws, whether it be restricting felons from having firearms or domestic abusers or people with mental health issues, those laws have all been upheld under the strict scrutiny standard.
Let's talk a little bit about strict scrutiny. One of the arguments made for the Second Amendment language in the Iowa Constitution was that 44 other states have this, and we're sort of conforming to what other states have. But only 3 states have this strict scrutiny language. So should we be following other states or going off on our own?
Well, I have no problem being a trailblazer in Iowa and trying to make sure that Iowans have the best protections possible. When we talked about this in the debate on the House floor, the argument boils down to the fact that what we're proposing with this language is codifying what the U.S. Supreme Court has already held to be the jurisprudence of the land. It's an individual fundamental right, it's a natural right for self-defense, and strict scrutiny should be the standard that is applied.
Then why not just use the language of the federal Second Amendment, which your party rejected during the floor debate, just mirroring the same language?
From my personal opinion, because Iowans deserve modern language that they can look at, read, not get back into the debates about whether this is a collective versus an individual right. Again, the way that we've simplified this language, and if you go back and look at what we passed in 2012, it was drastically different. But this language is very simple, straightforward. You can read it, you can understand it, and then you can make the decision when you're at the ballot box whether you agree that it's an individual fundamental right and whether you want that in our state constitution. So it codifies what the U.S. Supreme Court has done and does so in modern day language.
You know, a cynic would say this is just Republicans trying to whip up their base to get them to come out and vote in 2020. You know, what's your response to that? I'm sure you heard that during debate, but what's your response to that?
We actually didn't hear that during debate, but I've heard that argument before. My response to that is this: Iowans, whether Republican, Democrat, Independent, deserve the opportunity to have their voices heard on this language. That's the opportunity that we're trying to provide them. Whether they agree with this or not, they deserve that opportunity to vote on this in 2020.
Representative Smith, what do you think of all this?
You know, I think that there's a couple of things. We're talking about public safety. You made the comment with strict scrutiny, and we could have maybe some gun reform in regards to if it's applicable to public safety. Well, we have a public safety crisis right now with gun violence in our communities. And you know, one thing I do appreciate is our ability to have this conversation in a transparent manner, but I completely disagree. I think the general public is not really wise to the strict scrutiny language, because that in itself is extreme legalese, and we know our peers who are lawyers in the House debated what that language really meant. Even Representative McCain spoke up about his fears regarding that.
Let me just interject here so that our viewers understand the process. Constitutional amendments have to be passed by 2 consecutive sessions of the General Assembly and then put to a vote of the people. This General Assembly has now passed this language, and it will go to the legislature that Iowa will elect this fall, and sometime in the next 2 years it'll be discussed. And if it is approved, then it'll be on the ballot for approval by the voters in 2020, as Kathie suggested. So just to clarify that.
What do you think of the political I asked Representative Windschitl about the political implications of this, but what do you think of the political implications of this debate this year in 2018, and are you concerned about the effect in 2020?
I think moving forward, the impact may be, and as a Democrat, I think it gives me more to speak to. I think it personally, I think it may make it more difficult for Representative Windschitl because where we're at right now in the climate in our country, we know gun violence is at the forefront. Young people have showed that they're tired of this, right? People are dying, and I think we have to take some steps.
I want to switch gears in the conversation, lots of related issues, and talk about school safety. Representative Smith, what more should Iowa lawmakers be doing to make our schools safe?
I think we have to take opportunities to do the right thing. We just passed legislation, a school safety plan legislation, which I think is good for the state of Iowa, but I think we missed some opportunities there. We outlined a few different categories, one being prevention. And if we're going to be preventative, I think we have to create a mental health structure for our young people in this state that allows for not the response to a school shooting, but how do we decrease the likelihood of that even happening? And I think those preventative steps, I think we have a miss there. I think there's a gap that we're not covering.
Representative Windschitl, where is that legislation?
The legislation for active shooter training, we just accepted the Senate amendment this week, and that will be going down to the governor's desk. But that's not the only piece that the legislature and my caucus has been passionate about. We have also passed legislation to try and address the suicide awareness and prevention measures within schools, making sure teachers have adequate training to identify children that may be at risk. We're also talking about using the SAVE penny, which is their infrastructure dollars, to potentially use that for physical security within the school structures as well. There's multiple different things we've done. We've also expanded the ability for schools to use their flexibility dollars to potentially bring in counselors into schools to better help students that may be having problems at home. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to address, and we should be multifaceted, and we should be looking at all of those
What
things.
about the issue of arming teachers? We've heard a lot of discussion about that. Representative Smith, how do you feel about arming teachers?
Personally, I think that's a terrible idea. I think that's a step in the wrong direction. We've already seen an instant when we had a teacher shoot an individual, not in the state of Iowa, luckily, but that's already happened. I think, and I can speak for my district, I know our SROs do a really great job.
School resource officers.
Sorry, yes, our school resource officers do a great job. And I think they're the best buffer for this because they have relationships with students. They're able to see if a student's maybe out of their natural element or something's going on. They can see that, detect that first.
Representative Windschitl, arming teachers?
Well, I think that what Representative Smith brought up with the school resource officers is absolutely accurate, and that's why we've expanded the use of flexibility dollars. When it comes to the topic of arming teachers, I have always held the opinion that if a school district wanted to allow that they already have that ability under current Iowa law. It's in Chapter 724, 4B, subparagraph 2, subparagraph B. It says the school can determine who they would want to have in that district. Because in rural Iowa, it may make sense to have something like that if the school board and school district and community want that. It may not make as much sense in an urban setting. So there shouldn't be a mandate about that. That should, as it is right now, be left up to the local districts to make that decision what's best for the safety of their students and their communities.
We've only got a few minutes. James?
Representative Smith, you talked about what we can do to prevent school violence. There was a proposal in the House to have a red flag law,
yes,
where family members or law enforcement could seek a temporary court order to restrict access to firearms if they thought somebody was having mental health issues, for example. That didn't go anywhere in the House. Is there any likelihood that that will come back or make the case for a red flag law in Iowa?
Well, I think it gives us the ability to, and as a gun owner and somebody who really is passionate about our right to preserve the Second Amendment in the state that it's in now, I think that gives me a safeguard. It gives me a more comfortable, more safe feeling knowing that when an individual is unstable, we have the ability and the potential to, even for a restricted amount of time, make it so that they're less likely to do harm to others or themselves. Knowing the representative who's passionate about that bill, I think we will continue to see it.
Representative Windschitl?
I've actually sat down with multiple members of the minority party and had conversations with them just about extreme risk protective orders, and there's a number of different ways to couch them, James. You call them red flag laws. Look, I'm not opposed to trying to address that nexus where someone who has not been adjudicated mentally unstable and has not committed a crime, but genuinely needs help. They need to have mental health counseling. I'm not opposed to finding a pathway to having that person get the help they need. But you have to be very careful when we talk about these things because we don't want to be circumventing due process. We don't want someone to have their individual fundamental rights removed without first being able to go before a judge and saying, look, I don't have a problem, this is a fraudulent claim. So there's a way to do this, but we have to be very careful because if we're just going to arbitrarily take away someone's fundamental rights because someone's made an accusation, that's a huge problem, not just for the right to keep and bear arms, but for a lot of other rights as well.
Do you expect that, just a quick question, do you expect that to come up in this session, or is that something we'll be looking at in future sessions?
I believe that's something that will take a great deal of time and effort and work. So I think that's something that may come up in the future.
I just wanted to ask you really quickly, a judge in Johnson County said that the stand your ground law was too vague and didn't really expel out, you know, whether a person could be prosecuted under that or what that really means. Should you revisit that legislation?
I think that there may be an opportunity for that in the next legislative session. We don't have anything before us right now that would address that specific topic, but I have read that ruling that came out of Johnson County, and my takeaway from it was the circumstances of that case, there was not a clear delineation in the law that said that person should not be held criminally liable because of all those circumstances that happened. So each case is going to be different. And as we've tried to write a stand your ground provision for many years now, that's one of the things we've struggled with. How prescriptive do you make the law? Because we don't want to be tying the hands of law enforcement or the courts from being able to make sure that justice is served in a situation where it's a lot of questions out there.
Representative Smith, you spoke up against the stand your ground provisions last year. What were your concerns, and does this case, raise any additional concerns in your mind?
It does. Our main concern was the language, the way it was written. It was very vague, and perception is one of those things where it's really subjective to the individual, and I think we found that. And the fact that we do have all these different elements going into each case makes it extremely difficult. I think we have to do a really good job of educating the public because a sustain your ground provision is one in which individuals thought they had no rights to protect themselves and their homes and their property. And they already had that privilege with Castle Doctrine. And we've gone a little bit further, and I think we'll continue to see situations in which our judges are confused or the language is so vague that they're not sure when it's really applicable, and that's my main concern with this. What would you want to do to fix the law if somebody brings it up again next year? Well, my personal opinion is that I think it's unnecessary. I think it's unnecessary. So just repeal the law. You raise concerns, other people raise concerns about the effect on the minority community, yes. and concerns that they would be more likely to be victims of this law. Do you still have those concerns? I do. We've seen the data shows that in places where the stand your ground provision is in place, minorities are disproportionately impacted in a negative way, not only in being victims, but also in the way that the rulings come out in court, less likely to be able to utilize the stand your ground provision as justification.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back with another edition of Iowa Press next week at our regular times, Friday night at 7:30 and Sunday at noon on our main IPTV channel, with a rebroadcast on our .3 World channel Saturday morning at 8:30. For all of us here at Iowa Public Television, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.